All right, welcome again to the Think Orphan podcast. This is Rick Morton along with my cohort, Phil Dark. How you doing today?
I'm doing well. And I just realized that you said cohort. That's only one letter different from co-host. So either way, we're good to go.
But we are more than co-hosts to each other. We
That's
are
true.
friends and buddies and
Absolutely.
colleagues and all that kind of stuff.
And more.
Absolutely. Well, man, really excited for this episode and kind of our second video interview. So
I know it's kind of a whole different. It's third. Well, it's second interview. Third video. And it's just a whole different ball game, especially with your library behind you. It makes me feel so uneducated.
Well, I feel like because of our guest today that I have to have a fairly ostentatious library because we are talking to a scholar today.
Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. As we talked about before we recorded, I was really impressed with this book and excited to dig into it a bit more. Folks out there, if you haven't read it, Rick's going to tell you a little bit more about it right now, as well as our guest. I know it's a friend of Rick's. And like I said, really excited for today. And I am just not really sure where it's going to go, because this guy has so many stories that he had in his book, and it could go a lot of different directions, all of which are going to be awesome. Or would be awesome, because we can't go for all of them. Right, Rick?
Absolutely. But today we're welcoming in as our guest Todd Chipman. Todd is a professor at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas City, Missouri. He also has written the book, Until Every Child is Home, Why the Church Must Care for Orphans. And I remember sitting down with Todd a few years ago and hearing his vision for a book and what he was going to try to accomplish, and the idea of telling that through the stories of some great folks. And so we're going to welcome Todd in and get into the details about the book and hear a little bit more about the occasion of writing. But we just want to say welcome all the way from Kansas City, and thanks for joining us, buddy.
My pleasure, Rick.
We were just talking as we were kind of rolling into the interview. I mean, I remember several years ago sitting down with you at CAFO and having a conversation about this book, and just about the heart and the passion behind it, and the stories that you were kind of collecting and moving through that. And so really, really excited for us today to be able to dig in with our audience and point them to what is one of the stellar resources out there in orphan care.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. And I echo those things. And one of the things I always love hearing from our guests, it's just the story. It's your story. Just how you got to be called to write a book about orphan care, how you called to be passionate about loving the orphan and the vulnerable, what led you to write the book, what led you to cite to orphanology twice and only mention Rick once. Things like that are really interesting to me. So Todd, can you just share that with us? Just share your story with our audience, and love to hear that from you.
Yeah. Well, before I met Rick, my life was a mess, and I really struggled with a number of things. Let me just jump there. Rick and our CAFO years ago, and then I'll kind of tell some backstory of the book itself. Yeah. Went to CAFO that year as someone who was a new adoptive parent. I had heard a little bit about CAFO and sort of the world of Christian orphan care and adoption and ministries. Though my wife and I had already adopted, and we had some resources, basically Russell Moore's Adopted for Life and related literature and stories, I had no idea how big CAFO was or how many other folks were in this. But for me, what I had realized in the process of fostering and adopting was that my world, my theological and my ministry world was opening up. I liken it somewhat to a person who later in their life becomes addicted to jazz music. They just can't get enough. It's, Herbie Hancock and Louis Armstrong and Dizzy Gillespie and all the great jazz musicians from Kansas City. We have the History of American Jazz Museum here and so forth. And someone who gets addicted to that later on just loves it. They come to a point where was this all my life? Where I was just missing out on this. Well, for me, in some ways, fostering and adopting opened my mind, even though I already had been a pastor for more than 15 years at the same church. I had a long track record of ministry experience. I had a PhD in New Testament, and I had been teaching at a seminary some. That's just, how did I miss out on some of these things? Because fostering and adopting provides a relational proximity to practice what God has done for us. And so I went to CAFO with newly opened eyes, like that person who's at a jazz museum now and just, oh, this is incredible. For me, it was opening my eyes and realizing that I had an opportunity to connect some dots in ministry from a perspective of someone who's a pastor, who was a theologian, and who is now an adoptive parent, and help to shape both ends of that spectrum in terms of helping those who are fostering and adopting to have theological depth and power in what they're doing, and as a theologian to help folks who are into books see the practical way that foster care and adoption deals with cultural apologetics, I think in so many tangential ways. So that's really the story of the book. And I do remember that conversation there, just bouncing these ideas off of you. You had more experience in this line. And I'm like, I just need to do something here because I've got stories to tell and I've got experience and I've got biblical knowledge. I want to put it all together. And I do remember your encouragement there and others. And so here we are.
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad you did. I'm glad that the Lord really, has used you to shape this in a way that I think really speaks to pastors well. And you've broken down the idea of caring for orphan and vulnerable children into a very consumable kind of idea for churches that are busy and at times overwhelmed in the things that they're doing. One of the images that you use in the book is this idea of becoming a funnel for God. Like the idea of being that channel of blessing, and would love for you just to talk about that, and particularly from the perspective of a theologian about how our Christian worldview, how our biblical worldview informs how we should love orphan and vulnerable children around the world, and why that's such a gospel imperative.
I think about Deuteronomy 24. So we're here toward the end of the book of Deuteronomy. And there are a number of laws here, and some of them seem to kind of coordinate. Some we have to try to think about how the coordination works. But here toward the end of Deuteronomy 24, Moses is commanding Israel to care for orphans and widows. And he says, when you reap the harvest in your field and you forget a sheaf in the field, do not go back to get it. It's left for the foreign resident, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. So leaving this there is actually trusting God to bless us. So we're leaving that, but God's going to take care of us. And when you knock down the fruit from your olive tree, you must not go over the branches again. What remains will be for the foreign resident, the fatherless, the widow. When you gather grapes in your vineyard, you must not glean what is left. What remains will be for the foreign resident, the fatherless, the widow. Over and over we have this refrain. And the last verse of Deuteronomy 24 is the rationale. Here's why. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I'm commanding you to do this. So here's all these imperatives regarding your field, your groves, the resources that you have, and leave some behind. Because let me remind you, I take care of you. So I want you to go take care of them in a subsidiary kind of way, because remember, I did this for you. And so this is that funnel idea that what we've received from God, we're ready to give away. And foster care and adoption allows us to do that in ways that I have never experienced as a pastor. And I've had a variety of pastoral experiences. I've done weddings, I've done funerals, I've preached sermons, I've done baptisms, I've been in the hospital, I've been at people's homes for service projects. I've done a whole gambit for many years. But proximal, relational ministry in my own family and adopting kids has forced me to think about relying on God in ways I've never relied on him before. Emotionally, in terms of a leader and helping my family to adjust, my children to welcome new siblings. All of these kinds of ideas have put certain strains on me that I never felt in pastoral ministry or in the library working through scripture and interpretation, but I've had to here, and it's helped me.
Yeah, that's, I love that. I love that analogy too. I always love talking about that as far as just our heart breaks for what God's heart breaks for. And we also do what God does for us, for others. And just the idea of whether it's an overflow conversation or God is in our heart and we are doing what he does. And that's just, as you said, with orphan vulnerable children, something that it's hard to explain to people too when they haven't done it, but to help people understand the idea so that when they actually are able to go into it, it gives them something to hopefully understand a little bit more about what is actually happening. With that, I think it's a good transition into the next question that we have for you. And you talked about your role as a pastor. You talked about how you've had different experiences as a pastor, but one of the things I want you to be able to share, and a lot of people ask me this question, is how can you as a pastor, how can other pastors really make the care of orphan and vulnerable children part of the DNA of their churches, rather than kind of a side ministry, which it often becomes, where it's like, oh, Sarah is a passionate adoptive parent, so Sarah does all our orphan care ministry, and therefore we can check the box and say we love the orphans and widows in their affliction. So how can a pastor do that? I know you told some stories in your book, but also just from your perspective as you have been able to do that, what does that look like, and how can you encourage other pastors to do the same?
Well, that was some of the reason for writing the book and why I wanted to go to that CAFO meeting and I met Rick there and connected, is because I saw personally how strategic this kind of ministry is. And this is where I try to write from that perspective of the book. Early on, one of the titles that we were thinking about for the book was something along the lines of the strategic value of orphan care for the local church, so that it helps us. And what I argue in the book is that if churches and church leaders take just a few steps into foster care and adoption, they will quickly begin to address issues that they often are burdened about and want to address. They're thinking, let's see, how can I address racial tension right now? I mean, what pastor in America is not wanting to? Right? What pastor in the United States right now is not thinking about that? Well, that's a touchy subject, isn't it? Boy, it's difficult. And this is an issue that has a history that we need to think about. We have individual contexts in our own ministries. But if we involve ourselves in foster care and adoption, we're going to begin to address it. And not just on Twitter. Anyone can address these kinds of issues on Twitter, right? But actually in our homes and as a model for our churches and for our communities. Because disproportionately in the foster care system, the African American race is represented. That's a fact. That's not any commentary by me. That is just a fact from the statistics. And so if we step into this, we are going to begin to deal with African American children, families, and their cultural issues, and be able to learn about them. And many white families will take in African American children and think about that and grow in racial sensitivity, and in demonstrating how the gospel provides unity and how helpful that is for many churches. So there's one issue that we will deal with. We will also deal with abortion and preventing abortion. We will deal with the issues of human trafficking, which aren't getting quite as much attention right now in our culture because of COVID and because of the racial issues. But that's happening. It's happening every day in the United States, that children are trafficked. And those children, those girls, become women who often lead a life of prostitution. And I write about that chain of events in my book. And we can step in and prevent some of that in a very, very real way. We can deal with human trafficking. So racial issues, human trafficking, we can deal with poverty. And it's strategic. If you step into this ministry, you find that it has outlets for so many ministries and cultural concerns that are right on the front burner of many pastors' minds. So what I want to do is think help pastors to think about the strategic nature of this ministry, that it actually helps their churches if they can frame it and think about it in that way.
Absolutely. And I just thought you talked about each of those conversations you just mentioned are a different chapter of the book. And in each of those chapters, what we neglected to really talk about is you've interviewed, presumably, or you made up stories about these people, but I don't think that was the case. You were able to interview some great people, some friends of ours, several of whom have been on the show, and you dove into their story in ways that told the story about how we can really address a lot of these issues. And one of those things that you just talked about is not only the connection between orphan care and the sex trafficking epidemic, but just really how we can realistically get involved as the church, because the reality is 99.9% of churches are not going to, probably a higher percentage than that, are not going to go in and rescue children out of brothels. You're not going to, now you may prevent them from ever getting there, but what are some ways that churches realistically can get involved? And maybe use one of the stories you had from the book, but what does that look like from a church in the context of the orphan care and how it's connected with preventing it from happening by loving the children early?
Yes, that's it. So I write in the book, I have 7 sections in the book, and one of them is on trafficking. There are 3 different chapters in there, and each of the chapters I interview a different expert in this field. And I don't think I'll ever forget when I went down to Children's Mercy Hospital. Children's Mercy is a huge hospital in Kansas City. It had different campuses. It's a research facility. They do incredible work. And I heard one of their nurses speak at an orphan care event here in Kansas City about trafficking. And so when I got the contract to write the book, I circled back with her and said, I'd like to interview you and get some information. I don't think I'll ever forget sitting down in her office at Children's Mercy Hospital and her beginning to share about children whose lives were just under this situation of human trafficking, and who had been trafficked and abused, and talking about the number of children that they see who are brought in. Nearly all of them were in the foster care system. And if you just do the math, these children were once in the foster care system. Now they're living on the streets and owned and used. And she just told me the stories, and I began to listen to her and others and do research, even FBI statistics of busts and so forth. And the scenario runs something like this. These children who are eventually prostitutes or who are owned by a pimp, their lives were characterized early on by crime and drugs. So their parents are involved in crime and drugs, mom or dad arrested, there's abuse, neglect often involved in that. So they go to an extended family, a kinship placement, as we know the language often. Well, those folks' lives are characterized by crime and drugs as well. But then they're in a more vulnerable position, because these folks who are adults who are leading unstable lives, they don't have as close of a relationship with these children. And so there's a degree of extension there and a degree of distance. So there's more abuse, more neglect. So the state has to step in again, and then they're placed with a foster family. Well, that foster family is even further separated relationally from them. And so now, even if the environment of these children is not characterized by crime and drugs, their minds are. That's what's familiar to them. And so they are often heading in that direction, and they run. So by this time, they're in their maybe early teen years, or even 10, 12 years old, but they're on the street. And on the street, they go to crime and drugs. They are found by a pimp. And I write about the sad world of women who work for pimps and who recruit these kids and who prey on group homes and begin to buy gifts for those girls and boys as well. And they're just groomed for that kind of a lifestyle. So when Christians, when we step in and partner with our churches to foster and adopt, we cut the supply chain of pimps, and they have a business model that they use, and I write about that in the book. And it's not fiction. The FBI documents this. This is cold hard crime, and it's a sad world, and we can do something about it.
Todd, one of the things that I really appreciate about the book, and I appreciate about you, is that, we all share the conviction that the whole church needs to live out James 1:27. That this is not a calling for a few, but it's a general calling. But one of the things I really love about the book as a resource for the church is that you don't leave it in this general sense of, man, we all need to do this, but the stories really provide a vehicle to get very inherently practical and just really to get down to places where people can see themselves reflected. And one of the things that you talk about in the book is kind of through the lens of fostering and adopting. And so maybe I'd describe it this way. I think, sometimes we, especially now working in ministry with foster and adoptive families, we kind of realize that those of us that step into fostering and into adopting, it's a little bit like being the part of the Green Berets. And that's not to elevate the status. It's just to say, there's a, like, it's an extreme thing. It's a calling, and it's not like, that's not everybody's road, but yet James 1:27 is for everyone.
Yeah.
And so you talk about these 5 essential relationships that adoptive and foster parents need to have, and really how that, extends much of that understanding of the way that the body of Christ, gets involved and is involved. And man, I just love it if you just kind of unpack for our listeners a little bit, just give them a little bit of a tease of those 5 relationships and who they are and why they're important, and then we'll leave them to read the depth of it in the book, because we want them to go there and grab it as a result of this interview. But would love for you just to kind of expound on that a little bit.
Yes, the 5 relationships is an idea that helps potential foster and adoptive parents recognize that as Green Berets, they are going to need other soldiers around them, that they are going in. Rick, I appreciate your honesty there and its truthfulness. Sometimes when we talk with folks about this kind of ministry, there are 2 extremes. Like, over here is, this is so hard, and all of us who are doing it are just the most mature, the best people, all the rest. And that's not true at all. On the other hand, in fact, the more you do it, you realize how dependent on God you are. On the other hand, if we say, oh, it's not really that big of a deal, we're lying to people. It's hard. Sure. It is hard. It's harder than anything I've ever done, far and away. So we've got to be honest with that and recognize God's providence and all the rest. So these 5 relationships help the Green Berets, and it's true that it is hard, and it's God's grace upon you to do it. And there are people who can gather around you to help you and make it as successful in God's providence as it can be. And the first one is obviously your spouse. It's often the case that the Lord puts this kind of a ministry on one spouse's mind first, but they are one flesh with another human. And so there has to be a partnership. We have probably all seen, and we could tell stories of couples who one person drove ahead and the other was being dragged along, right? They just were dragging their heels, didn't want to be involved. Well, there has to be a sense of partnership there, and you have to work together and make sure that you're both on target. Often it's the woman who really senses this first. Well, she has to be patient, develop a partnership with her husband. The husband who wants to run into this needs to make sure his wife's on board. So it's a partnership there. It's a partnership with children who are already in the home. And this is something that parents need to be sensitive to. Even if they're just fostering and it may be respite kind of care, just weekend care, it will affect the children in your home. And you have to begin to shape their thinking. You need to develop a true partnership with them and help them to see how this will be challenging, but how it's going to be something their family's going to do, and how you're going to help them with it, how in the end it might even be good for them. And that's going to take time. There has to be, in any partnership, there's often a series of meetings and relationships and engagements that help that relationship to foster and to grow. And even with your own children, you're going to want it to do that. And then with your church, your pastor, get them involved to help them see the value of this ministry for the local church, the value of this ministry for them, and how you're going to need their help. And if you can get your pastor on board before you jump in, it's going to be much better than afterward. Too many couples have just run ahead, and then after the kids are ready to be placed in their home, hey, pastor, I forgot to tell you, or I've neglected to tell you, I've been busy and haven't told you that tomorrow foster placement's coming to our home. Could you help organize some things for me? That's just not going to go well. You have to recognize your pastor's busy and there are a number of demands. And so develop that partnership early on, along the way. Develop a partnership with your parents. This is perhaps one of the most important and often neglected aspects of foster care and adoption. Grandparents play a critical role. They may be the most critical role. If you can help kids who come into your home have a relationship with your parents, those kids who come into your home will have a sense of connectivity unlike anything else. They have multiple generations now interested in them, and I cannot emphasize enough how important that is. I often tell parents, or tell prospective parents, if you have good parents, you have a good relationship with your parents, they're generally healthy. They kind of live near you, even if it's just a few hours away, but they can be around in some ways. You have an asset for foster care and adoption unlike anything else, because you can get them in those kids' lives. My mother, who's still living, my in-laws are living, and even just this last weekend, they were together with our kids doing puzzles, playing. It has helped our kids so much, and it's a great resource. So that relationship is absolutely crucial. The final relationship is the local school district, because chances are, if you're fostering or adopting kids locally, that school has been family for your children. Schools are family for many, many children in the foster care system. My daughters, who are now been with us several years, the school district was their family for most of their life. When we picked our children up to bring them to our home permanently, we picked them up from school that day. The foster family that they were living with didn't even want to take off work to make the exchange. We picked them up from school. The school had a party. When we adopted our girls, and that adoption was final, and we had a party for our children in Kansas City, the principal of the school they were at, which is about 3 hours away, drove to be at our party, drove to Kansas City to be there, because she was their parent, essentially. And so schools, and I try to be specific there, Rick, to go to the school, make an appointment with the principal, talk about what you're trying to do, say, this is probably going to be the school where my kid comes. Can I just come and watch? Can I see what's going on? And then after your children start attending there, be the best volunteer that school's ever had. You're doing recess duty. You're doing lunch duty. You're bringing cookies for teachers. Just be there. And that also will show your child love, and it will help you have another connecting point, which that bonding mechanism is so important with kids. And if you get in the schools, you're going to be along the way. So with your spouse, with your children in your home, with your pastor, with your parents, with the school.
And Todd, I love that so much. And I think there's also, this idea of realizing that in some of those extended relationships, particularly in the school, relationships we have with CPS and in places like that, those are like, they're rich gospel opportunities in all of that. And it's our relationship, with our kids and through our kids that bring us into, connection with those people. And those relationships aren't by accident. Those things are part of God's providence as well. And so just, man, I love just the kind of the 360-degree thinking of, really being intentional about all those relationships. Well, one of the things that we do routinely with our guests is certainly we want them to get your book, and we want them to digest that because we've seen it as a great resource. But we also know that part of being a part of this community is just connecting with other resources and with other things that are good. And so anytime we have somebody like you on the show, one of the questions that we want to make sure and ask is, what have you read, or what have you listened to, or what have you watched that has really impacted your thinking about how to love and to serve orphan and vulnerable children well?
I think, and not to just blow smoke, but Orphanology, your book with Tony Maria, is excellent. I think you set out a parameter of issues that just helps folks to get connected and to see, the landscape. Obviously, Russell Moore, Adopted for Life, I think is perhaps one of the books that has had maybe the biggest impact, I think, on many Christians of the last 20 years. It doesn't get that high level, but I think boots on the ground ministry, it has affected so many churches and so many lives. So I think those two books. I think as far as podcasts, the Fostering and Adopting Home podcast that Lynette Ezell leads is excellent. She and her partner do great interviews, and they're just great interviewers, and they have an array of guests on who are in the know. I think, and we've mentioned already CAFO, but Christian Alliance for Orphans and their annual summit. I would just highly encourage your listeners here to attend if they haven't already at some point. I go every year now, some because I get to do a little bit to serve there, but I just get energized. And I tell folks, and so I get from a perspective of a seminary professor and a pastor, I get to go to some cool conferences. It's part of the deal. It's neat. But I tell folks, as far as the depth of spiritual commitment, folks at CAFO are far beyond anything I go to. For pastors, for theologians, just the vulnerability, the need for God, God's presence, people who are just right on the front lines, truly Green Berets. They are just my heroes, just as much as authors of books who help me understand Scripture better. When I see people fostering and adopting special needs children who will never walk on their own, I just think that's Jesus Christ's Spirit living in these people. And they do it, and they love, and they care, and they go the extra mile. So, yeah, those are some resources, I would say.
Yeah, those are some great resources that I think, I don't know that I've listened to that podcast yet, but I'll definitely have to check it out. But
Phil, the other ones, one other name comes to mind, Jason Johnson, who works for CAFO. But his blog and his books, Reframing Orphan Care, or Reframing Foster Care, it's what his book is called, his most recent one. But anytime I hear him talk about foster care and adoption, it's always within the framework of discipleship and the local church. And it's just spot on. I just keep finding myself saying amen. And his resources are very helpful.
Yeah, a lot of us say that with Jason's stuff. We were fortunate to have him, and I think the other folks on there, the only one we haven't had is Tony, and it's probably because Rick doesn't want to, have him come on and then make everyone realize that he wrote most of the book, and then that gets awkward. So
I knew we were going to get there, but just because you mentioned the book, Phil was going to get there.
Yeah, I think you should have them on and have people vote for the best beard.
Well, yeah. Although I did see a picture on Instagram recently, and he was pretty yoked, and I don't know that I think I'd be intimidated even over Zoom. So I don't know about that. But on that note, the last question we have, I always love hearing what books, and like Rick said, I totally agree. Like, folks out there, if you haven't read Todd's book, check it out. That last part about the 5 most important, that was the appendix. 5 most important relationships. So that's the appendix. Think about how much goodness is in the not appendix. I don't know, the regular body, I guess, right? So, and that isn't an appendix you want to remove. But that was a dad joke for us.
Love it.
But the last question we ask our guests, and it's always one, it may be one of the people you've already mentioned, but it may be somebody else. But what one person has most impacted your thinking on how we can love orphan and vulnerable children with excellence?
I think probably Russell Moore and his book Adopted for Life, and hearing him speak. I recall, to speak of CAFO again, a few years ago at CAFO when he was talking about churches and the value of this kind of a ministry in a local church. And he's an articulate guy. I mean, he speaks on lots of issues pretty quickly, and often with the kind of language that afterward you say, I don't think anyone could say it better than that. That's the idea. It's very clear. He couldn't get words. And I remember I was kind of struck, and I think the audience was, he was having trouble getting words to articulate the kind of culture that exists in a local church where orphan care is a part of the ministry in a natural way, but it's not all that the ministry does, like in a cultic kind of way, but is part of the DNA, and it propels the whole ministry on. He was having trouble sort of getting at the idea. And I just say that because there is an intangible kind of spiritual quality where the local church is healthy and Scripture pervades the congregation's thinking, so that orphan care is a part of what we do. But it's not all that we do. So it's healthy and it grows and it's strong, and everyone participates in some way to help, just as in other kinds of ministries. So Russell Moore, I would say, has probably been someone who's very influential toward me in that. And the privilege that he wrote the foreword for my book was an honor for me.
Yeah, that is a name that I imagine a lot of people would mention. But, I very much appreciate, Todd, you coming on. I appreciate the book that God wrote through you, what you're doing. That's very, very encouraging and inspiring to me. So thank you very much.
You're welcome, brothers.
Absolutely.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you, my friend.
Likewise. All the best to you.
All right, Phil. Great interview.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
Todd.
That was a lot of fun. I look forward to meeting Todd in person in the future. So that would be good.
Just, and the thing I love about Todd is that he really is, and he's pretty humble when he comes into a setting like this, but he's pretty much a consummate scholar, but especially you can just see the passion well up in him when he's talking about orphan and vulnerable children, and he has an ability to maybe put the cookies on the bottom shelf a little bit, and I really appreciate that he doesn't stay in the clouds, but really gets down to the practical things that the church can do. And
absolutely.
So I absolutely love.
Yeah, no, and then that was one of the things is you could tell just the way he was processing, and just he's very deliberate, very intentional, how he answered the questions, the word choice, how he said what he said, and you could really see that in the book as well. It was just very intentional, and that's where it just keeps coming to my mind, because I think he's got a purpose, he's got a vision, he's got a mission for that book clearly, but it wasn't just shoving things down people's throat, like you said. I mean, putting the cookies on the bottom shelf, not something I'd like to do in my house, but it's not something, it's something I need to work on, quite frankly, because I think sometimes, as I've said on this show, my wife will say, Phil, do you realize what you just said? And I said, yeah, I said this. She says, that's not what everyone heard. And, and sometimes that can be a good thing that they didn't hear it properly, but most of the time it's not a good thing when they don't hear it properly. And just when you leave room for interpretation, sometimes people will always interpret it all over the place. And so to be able to make it as not dumbing it down, but to make it more simple, to make it, to make it a simple conversation that really makes the main thing that brings it down to, okay, this is what I want to make sure people understand at the end of this conversation. Yeah. And that's something that is such a great skill. And, it's something that comes with a lot of practice, right? I mean, you can tell that he's done this a long time. He's a professor, he's a pastor. And as you said, the passion for what he does, this is not something he's doing because James 1:27 says to, it's a command to do it. He does it because God has transformed his heart, and he is clearly just doing this because he is a child of God who is doing what God loves.
Well, and I think, the thing I would want to leave our listeners with about the book is if you're out there and you're trying to figure out ways to get the body of Christ involved, if you're out there trying to think creatively about how can our church really be mobilized into caring for orphan and vulnerable children, this is a great book to pick up, because I think it and even some of the things that he talked about in the interview, with so much more depth, but just the delving into the issue of human trafficking and really looking at that from multiple angles, and the relationship between that and orphan care, but it's done in a really accessible way. You said it in that part of the interview, that this is not a, man, that's a problem, but we can't, like, it's not accessible to us. It's done in a way that it's just really accessible to the church. And I think I love the way, most of that's told through the eyes of someone, and through someone's story, and what you kind of walk away with a sense of is like, none of these people are changing clothes in a phone booth, right? They're not superhuman. They're
Right.
not kind of other than, they're just normal people like me and you. And it really gives a great view to how, just inherently normal people can be used by an extraordinary God to do things that are important, for the kingdom. And I really appreciate his contribution.
Yeah, I agree, and I do think, as we talked about in one of the questions we asked, and one of his answers is just really, if you're at a church and you're trying to figure out ways to connect with your pastor on what does it look like, how can we actually get our church involved? The thing that I love about it, like he said, is the issues we're facing in our world, like it's all, and we talk about that all the time on the show, right? The interconnectedness of all of this stuff that we're working on, the interconnectedness of everything going on in the kingdom, and the care for orphan and vulnerable children is absolutely interconnected with all of those things. And I love how this book goes into a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them. And
Absolutely.
and it was done in a way that as a pastor, he's speaking to pastors as well as to the congregations out there, and to Christians. So I absolutely recommend this book. I don't think that I have recommended it as official Phil recommends, so I'm doing that today. Dr. Rick and Phil recommends. Here it is. There it is. I'm fully recommending this book. I think it's one that has so much good to share with us, but also it's going to challenge you. It's going to have you think about things that you might not have thought about before, and it's going to give as we've talked about, a really accessible way for people who might not otherwise understand what this thing called orphan and vulnerable child care looks like across the way. And I think that it's a different take on it than like an orphanology or, some of the other books that might be kind of the landscape of orphan care, right? It's from a different perspective, and a lot of different perspectives. And that's what the other cool thing is. A lot of the guys, as I said, who've been on the show, their stories are further, he dives into those stories a bit more, and it was really cool. So very much appreciate it. So Rick, any last parting words before we close it out?
Brother, I think I'm good. I think we covered it well. We had a great guest. We had a little bit of a chance to visit together, and I think this has been another good episode.
I agree. So folks out there, as we're bringing it to a close, always remember to connect with us on Facebook. Connect with us if you want to send us an email, info@thinkorphan.com. You can sign up for the newsletter as well. As I said, I think it was a couple episodes ago. If you want to be a part of the newsletter and you want a newsletter to actually happen, then sign up on the contact page of thinkorphan.com. Because if we have like 3 people and it's my mom and Rick and me signed up, I don't think Rick signed up yet, then we're not going to do it, because it's a lot of time and we have a pretty short staff. So if you want that, and we can get it out more, and then you can share it a little easier, maybe sign up on the contact page of thinkorphan.com. A little pop-up will pop up and you can fill it in there. It's simple. And then, ask us questions. Give us different guests that you think would be good to talk with. I know that a lot of the guests we've had have come from that, you guys recommending them. So folks, especially now that we're not going to be seeing each other in person, really, at least in the foreseeable future. CAFO may happen this year, but it may not, given all the different changes, the ever-changing landscape. So right now, this is our way we can connect. This is our way we can ask the hard questions. This is our way we can have these tough conversations, and very much want you to be doing that. So the other thing, as always, that we want you to be doing is taking what you learned today, taking what you're hearing, you're watching, you're reading, and really, let God use it to help you understand how you can love orphan and vulnerable children better and better each and every day. Thanks a lot. Have a great week.